So I'd like to welcome from London the expert in international affairs, Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Thank you very much for being with us, sir. Dr. Papadopoulos, you're live with us from London. So I would like to ask you the following. In your opinion, why do we see so much instigation and so many attacks by the Israeli media against Mayadeen?
Mayadeen has every right to broadcast to all four corners of the world, no different to how BBC or Sky News or Israeli news channels broadcast to all four corners of the world. And quite frankly, I am absolutely appalled that the Israelis are taking such horrific steps to silence Mayadeen. Why? Because Mayadeen has an editorial stance on, for example, the Palestinians. No different to how the BBC has an editorial stance on the Palestinians. But the problem for the Israelis, and of course their backers, the Americans and the British, is that Mayadeen is supportive of the Palestinians, whereas BBC News is supportive of the Israelis. Now, we live in a day and age when journalism is being brutally assaulted, not just by the Israelis, but also by the Americans and the British. So, for example, in my country, in Britain, we see terrible restrictions being placed by the British ruling elite on independent journalists. But to go back to your question, the reason why Mayadeen is being assaulted by the Israelis is because Mayadeen is telling not just West Asia, but the rest of the world about the terrible plight of the Palestinian people, about the persecution of the Palestinian people, about how Palestinian civilians, including women and children, have been massacred by the Israelis ever since 1948. The Israelis and their backers, the Americans and the British, wish to silence any media outlet in the world which exposes the dark, malignant policy of, be it the Israelis or the Americans or the British.
Very well. Dr. Papadopoulos, in this report, and in light of all of the instigation that we're witnessing, the media in Israel has started mentioning people by name, especially the CEO of Mayadeen, Bassam Ben Shiddo. Doesn't this constitute a direct threat to this person?
The argument can be quite easily made that by the Israelis openly identifying key people at Mayadeen, they are inciting violence against those people. This is absolutely preposterous. This should be unequivocally condemned by all leading nations in the world. It should be condemned by the United Nations. Do Lebanese news channels or do Syrian news channels, for example, do they call for Israeli media outlets to be silenced? Do they identify key people working at Israeli media outlets? No, they do not. I bitterly oppose Israeli policy in the Middle East vis-a-vis the Palestinians, but I believe the Israelis, in the name of journalism, have the right to air their stance, no matter how much I disagree with it. But that is not shown towards other news channels in, for example, the Middle East, who take a different approach to how the Israelis and the Americans and the British treat the Palestinian people. Again, this is a terrible assault on journalism. Will countries in the world stand up for Mayadeen? Will they stand up for journalism? No, they will not. And this demonstrates again how journalism is in a terrible state, not just in the Middle East, not just in Europe, not just in North America, but across the world. Again, if people do not wish to watch Mayadeen, they don't have to watch it. I don't like BBC News, therefore I don't watch BBC News. But I believe that the BBC has every right to broadcast and to broadcast their opinion. At the end of the day, it is down to the ordinary man and woman in the world to decide what news channels they watch and whether or not they will be sympathetic to the editorial line of those news channels. Stop telling people in the world what to think and what to do. The Israelis, the Americans, and the British are not angels. They are not the policemen of the world.
At the same time, as we're talking about instigation, and there are many question marks, why is there an attack against Al-Mayadeen in the West Bank and in the Golan Heights? At the same time, all of this instigation, doesn't it constitute a direct threat against all Al-Mayadeen staff wherever they are, sir?
Well, first of all, this is intolerable. The West Bank does not belong to Israel. The West Bank is part of Palestine, of the Palestinian state. So why on earth are the Israelis saying that they do not wish to see Al-Mayadeen being broadcast in the West Bank? It has nothing to do with the Israelis. If the Israelis wish to prevent Al-Mayadeen from being watched in Israel, then I would disagree with that. But that is their country. But they do not have any right to tell people in Palestine what they can watch and what they cannot watch. Again, this is absolutely intolerable. Imagine if the Russians said this. If the Russians said something like this, Western mainstream media would be reporting on it 24/7. They would be relentless. But of course, the Israelis are allowed to say anything they want and do anything they want. And again, the world should be ashamed of itself. You ask about endangering the staff of Al-Mayadeen. Yes, of course it is. Al-Mayadeen journalists are journalists, no different to Israeli journalists or British journalists or American journalists. They have every right to report on matters. And in editorial pieces, in opinion pieces, people working for Al-Mayadeen have every right to express their opinion. No different to what the Israelis do, no different to what the British do, and no different to what the Americans do. But alas, there is hypocrisy at play. There are double standards at play. The Al-Mayadeen is clearly being targeted because it has a very large appeal.
So do you think that we're going to keep on seeing this kind of double standard policy and this kind of hypocrisy where Israelis, as you've said, have the ultimate time to do whatever they want against everyone, basically?
Of course we will see this assault on Al-Mayadeen, this assault on journalism in general continue, not just by the Israelis, but also by the British, also by the Americans. In Britain, if you have a different opinion on Russia, you are referred to as a Russian propagandist. If you have a different opinion on Israel, you are referred to as anti-Semitic. If you oppose multiculturalism and if you oppose immigration, you are referred to as racist. That is not just an attack on journalism, that is an attack on democracy. And that is another demonstration as to why the British, the Americans and the Israelis have nothing in common with journalism. They have nothing in common with freedom, and they most certainly have nothing in common with democracy.
Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, expert in international affairs, you've been live with us from London, the UK. Thank you very much, Doctor.